out his own thoughts.
Mm. So, CIL, he said, Andrew Wood of Tower Hamlets, I'm just recording now, by the way, Roger. CIL, Andrew Wood of Tower Hamlets, the councillor who was a Conservative, but he's left, hasn't he?
I don't know. I
think you told me that he left Tower Hamlets Council over the West Free Development.
Oh right, I think he said that he resigned from the Conservative Party in protest and is now an independent.
Right. So yeah, it's quite interesting. So he's an independent former Tory councillor who resigned in protest at the West Free Development, and then he refers to CIL as being earned. And so you looked up CIL, and they talk about capturing land value, and the first people to mention it are the World Bank, and it's part of the nationalisation of private property by default.
Yes. Okay, so it's kind of like a watered kind of Georgism. A single land value tax is a Henry George idea, and it makes perfect sense. It used to be a core policy, actually, of the Liberal Party, right? When they were liberal.
What does it mean?
Illiberal.
What does it mean? What is Georgism?
Well, basically, what Henry George said in Progress and Poverty is that as communities build up, at the centre of the community, the land becomes very, very expensive, and people get priced out, and the cost of the land it encourages speculation and basically hoarding of land, right? Which denies people access to one of the key components of production, which is obviously land. It's land, human labour, resources, right, and energy. Without those four things, right, you don't get anything and have all the money in the world. If you haven't got those four things, you're fucked, right? So if you want to have a commerce within a polity, right, you have to make sure that the people that will mix their labour, ideas and whatnot with the land have access to it. And so what he proposed was that to make sure that all land is brought into the best possible use was to have a use it or lose it taxation policy, right? And there's a brilliant film that was made in the 70s about Henry George's ideas, which explain how a developer that is hoarding land is taxed, whereas a developer which is actually using the land isn't taxed, right? And how the developer that's using the land does actually end up being better off. Now, if you marry that up then with the Beardsley-Rummel stuff about taxes for expenditure are obsolete, okay, which they are, and then if you add on to that...
Could you just explain that again?
Well, basically, taxation just takes money out of the system. It doesn't give money to spend, right? That's raised in a different way. That's part of the money creation system. Taxation is a means of directing economic activity into areas that you want to see it, okay, or to discourage certain activities which, you know, whatever level of governance you're dealing with, that they want to discourage.
Okay.
So taxes on cigarettes is a good example, but I mean, you get into all the stuff about elasticity of demand and all the rest of it. But what taxation does is it takes money out of the monetary circuit. You know, it doesn't, well, it slows down velocity to a certain extent, but it actually destroys money. When taxation is levied, that money ceases to exist. Now, right, within the ECB, they're trying to get a model where that isn't the case, right? Okay, to reinforce the whole idea of the debt-based money and money being a real control thing. But at its essence, Beardsley-Rummel is absolutely right. And so the MMT people are kind of onto this a bit as well, in that if you are a sovereign polity with a sovereign currency, right, you don't need taxation. See? This is what Richard Murphy doesn't understand, because Richard Murphy is a turkey that won't vote for Christmas. You know, the joy of tax, etc. Right? For him, tax is the thing in itself, and he hasn't looked behind what tax actually is. Now, to know what tax actually is and how it works, and to get a really good grip on a modern take on the single value land tax, right? You need to read Dr. Adrian Quigley. And I did a blog about a week ago where he put a paper into the Houses of Parliament in 2010, not long before he committed suicide. Very sadly, he committed suicide. He was diagnosed with some sort of cancer and decided to end it all. Now, I came across that because there's a guy called Richard Smith who ran as a Tory ran for the Tory party, but he published a website called the Melt Fund, right? Which again I've put on Web3, and he got involved in a few discussions with David Malone on David's blog back in the day, right? And the Melt Fund is basically a parody of rent-seeking financialized capitalism, okay? And it's hilarious, very funny. I mean, he took it down. I think he got warned off about it. Robin Smith is called. If you search Robin, you know, I've done lots of blogs about this with his discussion with David. He is actually still running a Cambridge think tank, which Dr. Adrian Quigley started. But Dr. Adrian Quigley's paper on taxation and money and the money token and how you should implement a single value land tax, okay, is the best thing that I've read by a country mile, right? He's basically, he was a computer programmer, he's a bit of a computer genius with a very, very tidy mind, very, very tidy mind. But there's no showboating, there's no, you know, you read it and you'll understand it. It's a fantastic, it's a brilliant paper. As I say, it's in the House of Commons.
Is that Smith or Quigley?
Quigley.
Right.
I read Progress and Poverty as well. I mean, you know, Henry George was considered, he was one of the most famous people at the turn of the 19th to the 20th century. He was hugely influential, but he's basically been forgotten.
So what you're saying is tax is generally a load of bollocks, but the land value tax is good.
No, I'm not saying tax is a load of bollocks. I mean, but what I'm saying is that the way that the taxation system relates to the money system is absolutely key.
Yeah.
To understanding what you can achieve through taxation, okay, and what you can achieve through the money creation process. The reason that particular connection is obscured is that it's basically to the advantage of centralised bankers and financialised rent seekers to obscure what is actually an obvious linkage. Okay, and Carol Quigley, you know, there's a whole passage in Tragedy and Hope about all of this stuff. I mean, I've written about all this stuff, but you know, it's mine. I've got all of the, you know, I mean, it's not the sort. I'm not a bumper sticker writer. You know, I'm not interested in bumper stickers. I'm interested in applied economics and how I apply it to actually making successful business. That's what I'm interested in. I'm a businessman. But most of these economists, including Steve Keen, recently seem to have gone off track. They have no basic instinct for business. They haven't got a clue. They you know, an academic in a position of power that you know, you have to give the answers they want or they will fail you in the exam, right? That sort of position of power, I mean, they'll point at power that everyone else has got, right? But that is a way that dead academic paradigms actually perpetuate themselves, okay? So you need to read people like Professor Bruce Charlton to get that, when he says that peer review is not scientific. There's nothing scientific, in a scientific method that peer review makes legitimate. You know, like Einstein said when the Nazis were sort of saying he was such a terrible guy, they were trying to disprove his theory. He sort of voiced, so 30 people signed it. It only takes one of them to prove me wrong. It doesn't matter what, if they haven't proved me wrong, they haven't proved me right. It doesn't matter how many there are.
Really, that happened? That happened? 30 people signed something saying he was wrong?
The Nazis, they issued trying to blacken his name, and that was his response. I mean, it's a very stoic response, they can't possibly know all my other faults if that's all they've thrown at me. But the essential.
I like it. Going back to where we were, because you were talking about Henry George and then the other chap, and so you were saying you've got Henry George's ideas, and then afterwards the ideas about the tax, and then how the creation of money and the tax system, central bankers don't want people to recognize that there is a link between the two, and they've sort of obscured it.
Yeah, and the Quigley paper absolutely squashes that. It's a perfect paper. It is an amazing piece of work.
And how does that link in with the points that you've been making about mortgage credit?
Well, he also published an article in the Ecologist magazine, basically talking about a carbon tax and how a carbon tax mixed in, can actually work quite well. The thing to understand about why a carbon tax would work quite well is that it's a very good proxy for the use of energy in an economy, because when you burn what's called fossil fuels, when you burn hydrocarbons, carbon monoxide then mixes with other oxygen, you get CO2, right? It's basic atmospheric chemistry, right? So a carbon tax is an excellent proxy for the use of energy, and energy is one of the main factors of production, or the main, human labour and creativity, energy, resources, and land, and money is a token for keeping track of them. And the definition of the monetary unit is another discussion which one would have to have, and that discussion can usefully be had with respect to carbon as a proxy for the use of energy, and also in terms of a proxy for the amount of energy that people need, what's a fair amount of energy to be rewarded for expending your intellectual or time, and and all of that sort of thing. Okay. Yeah. But a monetary unit as an abstract unit, and they all are, okay. It is a nonsense. It's a belief system which is totally unscientific.
And so what that links into your mortgage credit debate, because you're saying that people have wrong ideas about what money is, therefore, or have I got that wrong?
Well,
you're making a different point, aren't you?
Well, that's a different point. That really then you have to get into Thomas Paine then and Rights of Man and all the rest of it, and Chester Belloc come into all of this as well. Distributism is a part of all of this, and also Major Douglas and the social credit movement and all the rest of it, right? So,
did you say Chester Belloc? Is that a name? Did they call themselves Chester Belloc as a duo?
That's what people refer them to.
Right.
Yeah, and their economic system or ideas about economics are then labelled distributism.
And do you think that your mortgage credit idea is sort of coming from there?
Yes.
So can you just say again, you put out a tweet today talking about something about mortgage credit. Let's just have a quick look. And I'm sure you've just been setting me up to understand it. You basically said research into mortgage origination risk analysis. Mm-hmm. And I wasn't intending to have a conversation with you about it now, but I mean, I feel like you've covered bits of that
Well,
now.
I put that up as a magazine a few days ago because I've been reading a lot of the academic literature from central bank, think tank, and um, economists talking about credit risk and how loan to value ratios and income multiples are correlated with default, etc. I'm picking the bones out of all of that. Now,
Yeah,
part of the problem is that
yeah,
a
because
lot.
you were talking about who defaults, and you were saying sometimes someone who's very wealthy is more likely to default because they've weighed up the consequences of it and they can handle
Yeah,
it, whereas
yeah,
someone who's poorer but actually has a very reliable income stream is way more likely to make the payments.
right. And that was that. You know, I showed you that algorithm that was talking about being in the money or out of the money. If you treat the choice to either renew a taster rate or to default on a mortgage that's subject to a taster rate.
For a wealthy person, yeah.
And yeah, and that paper does basically say that the evidence does tend to show that the preference that banks have for mortgaged high net worth individuals are not necessarily, you know, I mean, it's all Taleb's fat tails as well, you know. I mean, they're putting all the eggs in one basket. It doesn't make any sense. And also the empirical data doesn't back up that belief. It just doesn't.
Okay. So overall, you're telling your investors that actually there's way more risk depending on the conditions, there's way more risk doing mortgages to certain people than there is to the types of ones that you're going to do.
Well, I mean, it's fairly well known because what the literature does show. I think something like 53% of all mortgages were self-certified at one point. You know, around 2008 day back.
Yeah.
And so when you drill down into that and see, right, of those 53% self-certified mortgages, you know, who gets to self-certify their own mortgage? It tends to be the richer people. I'm reading something at the moment, a Swedish paper on all of this, which is talking about a lot of people, because there's a cap here, a hard cap at 85% loan to value ratio. Couples and first-time buyers are tending to take out an unsecured loan to help with the deposit.
Yeah.
Which people are prepared to, you know, to
lend.
To lend. And then also from the data, it's quite, you know, that algorithm I told you about came talking about if you have a couple buying and there's a differential in their wealth, right, or income, they're more likely to default. And I think what that's about is that if you break up, right, what then happens? You know, the person with more money might be able to buy the other person out. And then the other thing, another huge passport is the records for the bank. See, have a good time, Reckless. It's the equity release mortgages that they want to do. And then that's that Times article, you know, with the guy, the Indian guy that was, you know, was doing an equity release, and the woman that would move back in with the parents to save up her deposit. And that's all happening again. You know, HSBC have now stopped doing first-time mortgages.
Yeah.
Obviously, because of the stamp duty.
They said because of too much demand, didn't they? Because I remember I didn't read it, but I read it and I sent it to you. I mean, I looked at the title.
Well, I mean, in terms of their own sort of loan book theories or whatever, they're just getting over. They want to balance their book, and all of their algorithm is telling them that basically
you've got enough now.
Overweight in terms of risk in that thing. Now, actually, their algorithms are wrong, is what I'm saying. You know, they're based on a confirmation bias that I'm seeing in more or less everything I read about this stuff. And that comes then back to what I was saying earlier about, boundary conditions and starting states are what are important. And they're talking about an absolute belief system, almost, an accepted.
So they're too busy. They're too busy lending in other areas which they think are have more return and are more reliable than to allow for the growth of the first-time buyer.
Well, I mean, it gets a bit more complicated than that. This is Per Womoski's point. And I sent him a thing the other day, sort of saying, look, I'm researching this, can we have a chat? He's the ex-World Bank director that is very, very critical of all the bar 1, 2, and 3, which is basically the regulations are stopping bankers from actually doing proper loan origination risk analysis. That happens to be, a fact of life. They put the wrong regulations in place to achieve what they're trying to achieve.
I got so on a completely different subject, because I was just thinking about Generation Rent, and I think Chloe's going to take a little break for a couple of weeks. That's what she said. I don't know, but I got an email from the Real News Network in America.
Oh right, okay.
Yeah, because they actually had a coup at the end of 2018, I think, and the guy, or maybe last year. So the guy who set it up is a guy called Paul Jay, and he set it up in 2007. He's been involved in loads of things, and they got rid of him, and so now there's other people in charge. I don't know who they are, but they claim to have whipped themselves into shape for all of their domestic US stuff. And so a guy called Charles, I think it's because David Graeber passed away. He sent me a message on LinkedIn and he said, we've been watching your David Graeber video again. Just want to reach out. What's happening? So I said something like, okay, well, that was a fun video. I'm still around in London. I don't have a crew. I might be lining up an interview with somebody quite soon, but I don't have no real platform. So if you have anyone in London or anything like that, to like hold the camera or do the editing or whatever, then I'm interested. He came back. He said, that's exactly what I wanted to hear. We're quite good at our stuff in the US, but we are not very good at freelance stuff. But, just to let you know in advance. So I think they always wanted
that's really good news, because that is a good interview that you did with David.
Well, it's just like one of our chats, really, isn't it?
Yeah. Well, I mean, you're great because you challenge ideas, but you don't rub people up the wrong way. You listen a lot when you interview, whereas lots of interviews are push their own opinions.
Right.
It's the line of question. People want to. So yeah. I mean,
it would be cool to get the opportunity to do that a bit more, and then as a topic. I mean, what about the stuff that we're talking about right now? Because in the US, they're not allergic to talking about mortgages and finance. You know what you were saying about the obscuring of the credit creation and the tax link, for example. I don't know how they feel about that over there, conversation-wise, in their alternative media, etc.
Well, it's Bill Still who made the Money Masters documentary and Masters of Oz documentaries, which are quite old now.
What's it called? The Masters of Money?
Yeah, Bill Still. So there is a segment of informed people, but the vast majority of people all over the world remain wholly uninformed about all this stuff. And when you start researching it, you run into lizards fairly soon, and also you run into alien space, all sorts of stuff that obviously is a lot more entertaining, but not necessarily going to help you understand what the basic dynamic is that they're obviously trying to throw people off the scent.
Well, it would be nice to I mean, let's say they were up for it and they were moving in that direction. It would be nice to be able to allow people to have conversations about people who are earning money and paying rent, being able to transition into buying their own places, not in what might be referred to as a purely subprime manner, as you've talked about before, but just in a kind of, you've got your own place now. Having that conversation.
All first-time buyer mortgages are not subprime. As in all affordable housing is not social housing. It's a ladder. A ladder is a very, very good analogy, or a very good metaphor for the for the housing landscape. I call it a landscape rather than a market. Because I mean, obviously, it's a basic human right, the right to shelter, and you have to understand the whole system to deal with blockages in parts of the system. And one of the major blockages at the moment is the one that I've identified, which is the 25 to 35. It's so obvious, and such a simple fix to put it right.
As in do more lending.
This is why I'm so highly critical of the build to rent thing and the modular crowd that are using it to do build to rent.
Yeah.
Using it for social housing, that's great. But when you get into the affordable housing, okay, so this is not even the intermediate housing. Because in that folder I sent you, the Mayor of London, the GLA, they recently produced a paper on intermediate housing, explaining what it is to them. Now, of course, the empty homes people are highly critical of Help to Buy, but also the definitions of social, affordable and intermediate housing, which obviously we encountered and looked at quite in depth with Telegraph Printing Works. And Richard Desmond has a preference for intermediate housing, right? Now, how you approach the social and affordable elements of housing, so that's both public sector and the housing association provision, where actually even Help to Buy, shared ownership or starter home just isn't a possibility. Obviously it has to be addressed, but you actually trying to address those first two segments through CIL and Section 106 agreements regarding developers providing housing of this sort. We've talked about corridors, we've talked about cash boxes in the sky and all of that, which are two ends of the same problem, but two ends of the continuum of that problem, right? Because cash boxes in the sky tend to be aimed at middle income or higher income people that want to rent. It's a very complex and dynamic system, but absolving local authorities from providing the first two, so we're talking about rungs, say 1 to 15, right? Then we're talking about rungs 15 to 20, right? I'm coming into the picture at rungs 25 to 35. Okay, there's a bit of overlap there, but the overlap from rungs 5 to 15 and 15 to 25, okay, are not as fluid as they are from rungs 20 to rungs 35. See what I'm saying? So what I'm actually saying is that if you want to have a healthy
market
dynamic of people moving into larger spaces as their families grow, and moving into smaller ones as they want to, say, release equity to fund retirement and all of that sort of thing. Because it is a good way of saving, but saving is not actually quite the same as investment in terms of speculative investment, right? And so what Per said to me is, where do you stand on the idea of homes as investment and homes a place to live in? And I said, well, I stand with everyone having, a first home as somewhere to live in, and it is a good way of saving. Okay, if you're paying rent, you're not saving anything. But, and if you have to be renting, then that property needs to be properly affordable. Okay, and not just another way of generating profits for supposedly not-for-profit housing association. So that's Mount Angle and Catholic and Priory Park, for instance. Now, that's just bullshit. That's crony capitalism gone berserk. So, breaking down how the housing need within a community actually works can't be reduced to this sort of binary, almost Nicholas van Hoogstraten attitude to people who rent property. You know who he is, don't you?
Yeah, the nasty landlord. Yeah.
Yeah, he and so, I mean, there are a number of buy-to-let landlords that got a bad reputation. I mean, it's like no blacks, no Irish. That the famous stuff from the 60s and 70s, and everybody thinks they know about this stuff, right? But they don't. I mean, I would say, in the past, where I have a mouthy investor that doesn't really know what they're talking about when it comes to my field, I just sort of said, they make a bit of money, they have a few successes, then they all think they're fucking Donald Trump. I mean, I was saying that in the 90s, even before he became president, right? But it's a real problem, because people are interested in things like the house price or the housing prospects of getting on the ladder and all of that sort of thing. And people fancy themselves quite the experts. But there are very few experts. I mean, I happen to be one of them. I mean, I'm not going to hide my light under the bush. I'm an absolute fucking world expert on this shit. I understand how it works, and I understand the parameters and the degrees of freedom I need to be able to deliver for my customers what I perceive to be a market need to answer my customers. Now, I'm a market animal, right? But the market isn't going to provide solutions for rungs 1 to 15. It just it isn't. It never has. And so how do you deal with that? Not with 106s and CIL payments, and with confused people like Andrew Woods, where he's kind of saying, oh, don't build anything until we figure out what we can spend the CIL on and make sure the bastards are paying it because it's a tax, because it isn't.
Oh, I see what you mean. Much clearer now. So basically, don't you get it? The CIL goes with the development. You don't stop the development until the CIL comes. You say you do both at the same time. They just belong together.
CIL is a function of development actually happening, because the development needs the infrastructure for the infrastructure to be viable. And that's not to be confused with financial viability in providing affordable housing. But what they're doing is they're trying to chuck too many things that don't really mix into a basket, and it's obscuring the fact that Sadiq Khan, Mayor John Biggs, Uncle Tom Cobley and all, Steve Reed, have not got the balls to take responsibility for providing in the public sector what needs to be provided from there, and holding to account the not-for-profit housing associations like Catalyst, like Pocket Living. There are others, but I'm happy to mention those two, and criticise them because they should be criticised. Friary Park is an outrage. It just is. So London School of Economics have done some really good work on this stuff. But they did most of it about 3 to 5 years ago. They got a very good YouTube channel. There's one video they produced about foreign investment into high density residential, and they look at a scheme actually next to the Millennium Dome.
But hold on, Roger. You're saying that they're doing some good work. Brilliant.
They were doing. I don't know if it's still funded. It seems to have dried up a bit.
The thing is, what you call good work may well be good work, but the thing is, for me, it takes somebody, let's say, it takes somebody like you to have a look at it. And because, as you say, you're someone who understands a lot of this stuff, you can look at it and you can say, you know what, that's quite good work. But then when you start going to the front line, because you're saying that a lot of people don't understand this stuff, when you start either going to the front line or going to the decision-making area of, say, local politicians, then the criticism that you've just made, that Sadiq Khan, John Biggs, Steve Reed should be calling people out and certain, referring to certain systems and plans as outrages, and they're not doing it. Well, who's saying that they should do that? I've heard you do that, but does the LSE stuff do that? Does it say that? Or does it just provide the data to help somebody make up their mind?
Stuff, it's objective academic research.
Sure.
So,
so who else is saying it? Does Empty Homes say what you just said?
Empty Homes have got a part of it, but the person who really says it is Chloe in Generation Rent. It's a fantastic book. It's a great introduction to the subject, and she's obviously considered a lot of what we're talking about now. It is an absolutely excellent book. I mean, they should put it on the syllabus for economics, in O-level economics or something. I mean, like I say, it's a great introductory text to some of these areas. Every MP should be forced to bloody read it.
It's quite interesting because do you remember how I was part of this reading group, which may be revived? I was one of the people who lobbied for Donut Economics to be on the list. Okay.
I'm not a big fan of Kate Horwath at all.
Well, sure. The thing was, I'd heard about it, and I remember reading the beginning and thinking, I was so impressed with what she was saying at the beginning about storytelling. She basically says, economics and storytelling, if you can't tell a story, then, the story doesn't, then no one will understand. So whilst I got really excited...
Then she loses the plot and tells a very tall story.
Well, can I just say that when I turned up to the reading group when we had to do it, I sort of said, okay, I was the person who chose it. I didn't even finish it, I don't think. I mean, I don't know. But I sort of just said, but I'm so glad so many of you turned up and we could all have a chat about it. But, I mean, really. But so what I wanted to say was this. Although I got excited about it, and other people did too, George Monbiot said everyone has to read it, blah-de-blah, everything that you just said about Generation Rent is, it's interesting. And so anyway, back to the original point where you said she's calling it out. It sounds as though it's just fundamental to this country's future that more and more people call it out in the way that you just have and the way you say Chloe does.
I'm implementing a bit of Paulo Freire, really, activism without actually action, without practice. It's just blah, blah, blah. That's a direct quote. He said it's just blah, blah, blah.
Right. I love it. Well, shall I let you carry on a little bit today, and we'll chat again later?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. It's been very useful just to be able to chat because obviously I've got to write my story.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think you put a couple of traces in those tweets, which is the reason why I sort of felt that we could have this chat, because you put that tweet out about an hour or two ago, and I thought, oh, right, well, whilst you're on the subject, you can switch my brain on and get me active and, get a bit more ready to carry on with your position paper.
Yeah, all right then.
Okay, thanks a lot, Roger. Talk to you in a bit. Bye.
Bye.